The brass paneled walls of the luxury elevator hummed a low, indifferent vibration, a lullaby for a coffin that Mildred Severt never asked to climb into. She pressed her spine flat against the rear corner, clutching the tan delivery bag to her chest, the way a drowning woman clings to driftwood. The neon green high-visibility vest she wore, stamped with the words, "Rapid Deliveries," in thick white letters, glowed almost mockingly beneath the elevator's warm overhead light. A beacon of normalcy trapped in a situation that had gone horribly, irreversibly wrong. 30 seconds ago, the night had been routine. One last drop-off, penthouse suite, Tower Genevieve, Upper East Side. Her dispatch app had pinged at 11:47 p.m. with a priority parcel. And Mildred had groaned the way every underpaid gig worker groans at a late-night job, not because she wanted to go, but because declining meant losing her completion bonus for the week. She needed that bonus. Rent was 4 days late. Her phone screen had already been cracked for 2 months, because replacing it meant choosing between seeing clearly and eating consistently. So she had thrown her heavy black hoodie over her braids, slung the bag across her body, and pedaled her rust-spotted bike 12 blocks through the sharp March wind. The lobby of Tower Genevieve had smelled like sandalwood and old money. The building was one of those mixed-use monuments to Manhattan excess commercial tenants and private offices on the lower floors, luxury residences stacked above them like tiers on a wedding cake nobody was invited to. A doorman in a gray wool coat had barely glanced at her vest before buzzing her through to the service elevator, not the resident one, never the resident one, and she'd stepped inside, pressing the button for the 31st floor with a thumb still numb from the cold. That was when the evening split itself in half. The doors had begun to close, that soft hydraulic sigh of chrome sliding toward chrome, when a hand the size of a dinner plate shot between them and forced them back open. Stephen Kenny filled the elevator the way a boulder fills a riverbed, completely, violently, and with the unspoken promise that nothing downstream would ever flow the same way again. He was enormous. Not Jim Selfie enormous. Not Weekend Warrior enormous. He was the kind of enormous that made the air in the elevator feel suddenly thinner, like his body was physically consuming the oxygen Mildred needed to breathe. A tight black tank top clung to a torso carved from something harder than muscle, each ridge and slab of his physique straining against the fabric as though the architecture of his body resented the very concept of clothing. Dark tactical cargo pants hung from his waist, and fingerless tactical gloves wrapped his knuckles with the quiet authority of a man who had been in enough violent encounters to accessorize for them. He didn't look at her. Not at first. He stepped inside with the unhurried confidence of someone who had already decided how the next 60 seconds would play out, and the doors sealed shut behind him with a sound that now felt less like a mechanism and more like a verdict. The elevator climbed. Floor 12, floor 13. Mildred kept her eyes on the floor indicator, willing the numbers to move faster. She adjusted the strap of her delivery bag, a nervous reflex that her hands performed without consulting her brain. She could feel him standing to her left, a wall of heat and controlled aggression radiating outward like the idle rumble of a truck engine. Her heartbeat was doing something complicated in her throat. She told herself it was nothing. People got in elevators. Big people got in elevators. This was a building full of tenants and guests, and perfectly explainable reasons for a man built like a weapons depot to be riding a service elevator at midnight. Floor 19. Floor 20. The elevator lurched. It wasn't a gentle stutter. It was a violent, mechanical seizure, a grinding halt that threw Mildred sideways, her shoulder slamming into the brass railing as the overhead light flickered once, twice, and then steadied into a sickly amber glow. The floor indicator froze between 20 and 21, the digital display blinking like a stuttering heartbeat. Mildred's stomach dropped. She reached instinctively for the emergency call button, but before her fingers could touch the panel, a hand, massive, gloved, deliberate, slammed against the wall directly beside her head. The impact echoed through the confined space like a gunshot. She turned, and for the first time, Stephen Kenny looked directly at her. His face was contorted into something primal, not anger, Not frustration, but the raw, territorial aggression of a predator who had just cornered something small and warm. His jaw was clenched so tightly the muscles in his neck stood out like cables, and his eyes flat, dark, utterly devoid of anything resembling restraint, locked onto hers with a focus that told Mildred, with absolute and bone-deep certainty, that this elevator had not malfunctioned on its own. "The bag," he said. His voice was low and thick, barely above a growl, and it filled the small space the way smoke fills a sealed room slowly, suffocatingly, leaving nowhere clean to breathe. "Put it down. Now." Mildred's back hit the corner. She could feel the cold brass panel pressing into her spine, the railing digging into her lower back. She clutched the tan delivery bag tighter against her chest, her knuckles bleaching white beneath her dark skin. Her mouth opened, but the words tangled somewhere between her lungs and her teeth, because every survival instinct she'd ever had was screaming at her simultaneously, and the combined noise was deafening. I'm just a courier," she managed, her voice cracking like thin ice. "I don't know what's in it. I just deliver." "I said put it down," he roared. The word exploded from his chest like something caged and furious, and the sheer volume of it in that tiny, sealed chamber slammed into Mildred like a physical force. She flinched so hard her teeth clicked together. He leaned forward, his massive frame eclipsing the overhead light, casting her in his shadow. One hand remained pressed against the wall beside her head. The other reached for the bag. Mildred squeezed her eyes shut. She could feel his breath against her forehead, hot, sharp, carrying the faint chemical edge of something she couldn't name. This was it. There was no alarm to pull, no door to run through, no sidewalk to sprint down, and no stranger on a street corner to scream toward. There was only the hum of a dead elevator, the smell of brass polish and sweat, and the crushing, absolute certainty that she was about to be hurt, and that no one in this tower of marble floors and crystal chandeliers would hear a single sound. And then a screech. Not from inside the elevator. From outside. Metal against metal. A grinding, tortured shriek that cut through the suffocating silence like a blade dragged across a steel table. It was the sound of something that was never meant to be opened, being forced open by something or someone that refused to accept the word impossible. Stephen froze. His hand stopped inches from the bag. His head snapped toward the elevator doors, and for the first time since he'd stepped inside, Mildred saw something new flicker across his face. Uncertainty. The heavy steel doors groaned. They buckled inward slightly, as if something enormous was pressing against them from the hallway beyond. Then, with a shuddering metallic scream, a gap appeared narrow at first, barely a sliver of fluorescent hallway light cutting through the amber gloom. But the gap widened, steadily, relentlessly. And in the growing light, Mildred saw the hands. They were bare, long-fingered, elegant, almost, in the way a sculptor's hands are elegant but covered in intricate dark tattoos that crawled from the knuckles up past the wrists, disappearing beneath the sleeves of what Mildred's overwhelmed brain dimly registered as a perfectly tailored black suit jacket. The hands gripped the edges of the steel doors with a calm, mechanical precision that was somehow more terrifying than Stephen's brute fury, because brute fury was at least human, at least recognizable, and this, whatever this was something else entirely. The doors parted, fully, completely, and standing in the fluorescent wash of the 20th floor hallway, with the stillness of a man who had nowhere to be and all the time in the world to be terrifying, was Dae-Jung. He was not a large man, not in the way Stephen was large. He was lean, composed, tailored a crisp white dress shirt open at the collar beneath that immaculate black suit, no tie, his dark hair slicked back with deliberate precision, but his eyes sharp, dark, and utterly, unnervingly calm, swept the interior of the elevator with the dispassionate focus of a surgeon opening a patient. He looked at Mildred first, then at the bag she was clutching, then at Stephen Kenny, all 6'4", 260 pounds of snarling, heaving muscle, and his expression didn't change. not even slightly. "Step away from her." 3 words, spoken softly. No growl, no shout, no theatrical threat. Just a quiet, level command delivered in a voice that carried the same temperature as the tattoos on his hands, cold, deliberate, and permanent. Stephen's lip curled. "You don't know who you're." Dan moved. It wasn't fast in the way action movies are fast, all blur and noise and exaggerated choreography. It was fast in the way a power outage is fast. 1 second the lights are on, and the next second they are not, and your brain spends the first heartbeat simply refusing to accept that the world has changed. Dan was in the hallway, and then Dan was inside the elevator, and then Stephen's head was bouncing off the brass panel with a sound like a church bell being struck with a fist. And Mildred didn't even have time to scream before the enormous man crumpled sideways, his knees buckling, his gloved hands grasping at nothing. Dae-Jung stood over him, unhurried, his suit unrumpled, his breathing unchanged. He straightened one cuff, a small, precise movement, almost contemplative, and then he turned to Mildred. His eyes found hers, and in them she saw something she hadn't expected. Not pity, not warmth, but a quiet, granite-hard recognition, the look of someone who understood exactly what it felt like to be trapped in a small space with a monster, and who had long ago decided to become the thing that monsters were afraid of. "Can you walk?" he asked. His voice was measured, unhurried, as if he had not just pried open an elevator with his bare hands and dropped a man twice his width with a single strike. Mildred's legs were shaking. Her jaw was trembling. The delivery bag was still pressed to her chest like a shield, and her eyes were still wet. And every part of her body was screaming at her to collapse onto the floor of the elevator and not move for approximately the rest of her natural life. But she nodded. "Then come with me," Dan said. He extended his tattooed hand, palm open, fingers steady, not grabbing, not pulling, just offering, and Mildred Severt, a 24-year-old delivery courier who had started her evening wanting nothing more than to finish her shift and eat leftover rice from a Tupperware on her kitchen counter, took the hand of the most dangerous man in the building and stepped out of the elevator and into a world she did not yet understand. Behind her, the brass-paneled walls hummed their low, indifferent vibration. The floor indicator blinked between 20 and 21. And Stephen Kenny lay crumpled on the polished floor, unconscious but breathing the first casualty of a war that Mildred didn't know had already begun, fought over a package she didn't know she was carrying, in a world she was never supposed to see. But the doors were open now, and there was no going back. Before we start, go ahead and subscribe, like, and share where you're watching from. It always warms my heart to see our little storytelling family stretch across the world. Every click, every comment, every bit of love you give helps us keep uncovering these unforgettable stories together. So find your quiet place, settle in, and let me take you somewhere you've never been before. Dae-Jung did not walk quickly. That was the first thing Mildred noticed as he led her down the 20th floor corridor. He moved with the measured, unhurried gait of a man who had never once in his life been chased by anything he couldn't turn around and destroy. His tattooed hand had released hers almost immediately after she'd stepped out of the elevator, a brief and deliberate contact that communicated everything it needed to and nothing more. He walked slightly ahead of her, close enough that she could smell the faint trace of cedar and clean linen coming off his suit jacket, far enough that she never once felt crowded. Behind them, the elevator sat open like a wound. Stephen Kenny's unconscious body was still folded against the brass paneling, one arm draped at an angle that didn't look entirely natural. Even from the corridor, Mildred could see the shallow rise and fall of his chest. Dan glanced back once and spoke a single clipped sentence in Korean into a phone she hadn't seen him produce. She didn't understand the words, but she understood the tone. Clean it up. Within minutes, she knew someone would come for Stephen, but whether that someone worked for Dan or for whoever had sent Stephen was a question that wouldn't answer itself until morning. Mildred glanced back once, just once. Her legs were still trembling beneath her dark work pants, and the neon green vest felt absurd, now a costume from a life she had occupied 90 seconds ago and might never occupy again. "Where are we going?" she asked. Her voice came out smaller than she wanted it to. She hated the sound of it. "Somewhere that isn't here," Dan said, without turning around. He stopped at a door at the far end of the hall, unmarked, matte black, with no visible handle. He pressed his thumb to a small panel recessed into the frame, and the door clicked open with a sound like a whispered agreement. He held it for her. Not performatively, not in the way that demands a smile and a thank you, but functionally, the way a person holds a door when the thing behind you is worse than the thing ahead. Mildred stepped through. The room on the other side was not what she expected. She had braced herself for something cinematic, a dim, smoke-filled lounge with leather chairs and men in dark glasses, the kind of underworld aesthetic that movies had trained her to anticipate. Instead, she found herself standing in what looked like a private office designed by someone who valued silence above all other luxuries. The walls were a muted charcoal gray. A wide desk of dark walnut sat near the far window, its surface holding nothing but a closed laptop, a single glass of water, and a small ceramic dish that might have been an ashtray or might have been art. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a view of the city below, all cold light and distant traffic, the kind of panorama that rich people paid millions for and then forgot to look at. Dan closed the door behind them. The click of the lock was quiet, precise, final. "Sit," he said, gesturing to a chair opposite the desk. It wasn't a command. It was closer to a diagnosis, as if he had assessed her trembling legs and concluded, accurately, that standing was a temporary arrangement her body was about to renegotiate without her consent. Mildred sat. The chair was soft, absurdly soft. She gripped the armrests and tried to steady her breathing, suddenly aware of how hard every other surface in her life was: the plastic seat of her delivery bike, the wooden stool at her kitchen counter, the bench at the laundromat where she waited for her single load every Sunday. Dan sat on the edge of his desk, not behind it. He crossed one ankle over the other, folded his tattooed hands in his lap, and looked at her with that same unreadable calm, the expression of a man who was not deciding whether to trust her, but rather cataloging the exact dimensions of the problem she represented. "The bag," he said. Mildred's arms tightened around it instinctively. The tan canvas was warm against her chest, slightly damp from where her palms had been sweating through the fabric for the past several minutes. She looked down at it, this unremarkable courier package that her dispatch app had described as a priority parcel, category, documents, weight, under 2 pounds, delivery instructions, hand to recipient, signature required. "I don't know what's in it," she said quickly. "I never open the packages. We're not supposed to. The app assigns a pickup. You go to the address. You scan the barcode. You deliver. I've never... Open it." She looked up at him. His expression hadn't changed, but something in his eyes had shifted, a tightening, a focus, the way a lens adjusts when the thing it's been searching for finally comes into frame. Mildred's fingers found the zipper of the delivery bag. The teeth parted with a sound that felt too loud in that silent room. She reached inside and pulled out the contents. It was a ledger, not a digital file, not a USB drive, not anything that belonged in the current century. It was a physical, leather-bound book, dark brown, roughly the size of a hardcover novel, with no title on the cover and no markings on the spine. The leather was worn at the edges in the way that things get worn when they've been handled frequently and carefully by people who understand their value. A thin, elastic band held it closed. Dan leaned forward. For the first time since Mildred had seen him, his composure shifted, not cracked, not broken, but tilted slightly, the way a perfectly balanced scale tilts when a single grain of sand lands on one side. He extended his hand, and Mildred placed the ledger in it with the careful, instinctive reverence of someone handing over something they didn't understand, but could feel the weight of. He slipped off the elastic band. He opened the ledger. Mildred couldn't read the contents from where she sat, but she could read Dan's face and what she saw there was more frightening than anything Stephen Kenny had done to her in that elevator. Dae-Jung's eyes moved across the pages with the slow, consuming focus of a man reading his own autopsy report. His jaw tightened. The muscles along his forearm flexed beneath the tattooed skin. He turned one page, then another. Then he stopped, and he was very, very still for a long time. "Do you know what this is?" he asked. His voice was quiet, quieter than before, the kind of quiet that precedes something shattering. Mildred shook her head. Dan closed the ledger. He set it on the desk beside the glass of water with the deliberate gentleness of someone placing a loaded weapon on a table. Then he looked at her, really looked at her. Not through her, not past her, but directly into the tired, terrified, rain-damp face of a 24-year-old courier in a neon vest and said, "This is a record of every dollar that has been stolen from me for the past 3 years. Account numbers, routing codes, shell companies, names." He paused. "Names of people who are going to be very, very motivated to make sure you never tell anyone you carried this book across the city tonight." The words landed in Mildred's chest, like stones dropped into still water. She could feel them sinking slowly, heavily, displacing everything they touched. I don't have anything to do with any of this," she whispered. "I'm a courier. I pick things up and I put them down. I'm nobody." "You are nobody," Dan said. Not cruelly, not dismissively, with the flat, clinical accuracy of a man correcting a navigational error. "You stopped being nobody the moment you walked into that elevator carrying 3 years of evidence that a man named Victor Hale has been embezzling $16 million from my organization and funneling it through his time. Enforcers Network." He nodded toward the door, toward the hallway, toward the elevator where Stephen Kenny was still sprawled across the polished floor. "That man in the elevator works for Hale. He wasn't there to rob you. He was there to intercept the ledger before it reached its destination, a recipient on the 31st floor who is part of my organization. Someone in my own circle arranged for the ledger to be routed through a civilian courier service to avoid my surveillance. They wanted it to reach a loyal contact upstairs without passing through any of my usual channels. But Hale found out, and he sent Kenny to take it before you ever reached the penthouse." He paused, and something cold settled behind his eyes. "Which means I have a traitor on one side and a thief on the other, and you, unfortunately, are standing in the middle." Mildred stared at him. The room felt smaller. The soft chair felt less like comfort and more like quicksand. "What does that mean?" she asked, even though every nerve in her body was already answering the question. "It means you're a witness," Dan said. "It means they've seen your face, your vest, your route. It means the dispatch app that assigned you this delivery has your home address, your phone number, your emergency contact, and it means that by sunrise, Victor Hale will have all of it." The silence that followed was the loudest thing Mildred had ever heard. She thought about her apartment, the studio on 143rd, with the radiator that clanked all night, and the window that didn't lock properly because her landlord had promised to fix it 4 times and never had. She thought about the fire escape bolted to the back of the building, the one she'd sat on during heat waves because her unit had no air conditioning, its rusted iron steps descending into an alley that smelled like wet cardboard and gasoline. She thought about the Tupperware of leftover rice sitting on her kitchen counter, and for a brief, irrational moment, the thing that frightened her most was the realization that she might never eat from that container again. "I can't go home," she said. It wasn't a question. "No," Dan agreed. "You can't." Another silence. Mildred's hands were clasped in her lap, her knuckles tight, her thumbnail digging into the pad of her index finger, a habit she'd carried since childhood, a private metronome of anxiety that no one had ever noticed, and she had never tried to stop. "So, what happens to me?" Dan studied her. It was a long, measured look, the kind that most people would have filled with reassurance or false comfort, or some hollow promise about everything being fine. Dan did none of those things. He simply assessed, calculated, and arrived at a conclusion with the same quiet efficiency he applied to everything. "You stay here," he said. "Tonight. Tomorrow. As long as it takes for me to dismantle the operation that put you in that elevator. This floor is mine. The building's security answers to me. No one enters without my knowledge, and no one leaves without my permission." He paused, and the pause carried something Mildred hadn't heard in his voice before, not warmth, exactly, but a rigidity, a line drawn in stone. "I don't involve civilians in my work. I don't use people as leverage, and I don't leave debts unpaid. You were put in danger because of something that belongs to my world, and that makes your safety my responsibility. Not a favor, a debt." Mildred searched his face for the lie. She had been lied to by enough landlords, enough supervisors, enough dispatch algorithms promising premium bonuses that never materialized. To recognize the architecture of deception, the too quick smile, the overly specific promise, the eye contact that held a beat too long. She found none of it in Dae-Jung's face. What she found instead was something harder and, in its own way, more unsettling. The absolute, unflinching sincerity of a man who operated by a code so rigid it left no room for dishonesty. Because dishonesty was inefficient, and inefficiency was something Dan simply did not permit. She stayed. The first night was shapeless, a blur of exhaustion and adrenaline that refused to resolve into sleep. Dan had shown her to a guest room down the hall from his office, a sparse but immaculate space, with a bed that was wider than her entire bathroom at home. She lay on top of the covers in her hoodie and work pants, the neon vest folded on the nightstand like a relic from an archaeological dig of her former life. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Stephen Kenny's face, the flat, dark emptiness of his stare, the way his hand had slammed beside her head, the feel of the brass panel against her spine. She slept in fragments, shallow and restless, surfacing every hour to stare at the unfamiliar ceiling and remind herself where she was. By the second day, the adrenaline had metabolized into something quieter and more corrosive: awareness. Mildred began to understand, in the slow and irreversible way that a person understands gravity only after they've already fallen, the scope of the world she had stumbled into. Dan's operation was not a gang. It was not a crew. It was an infrastructure, a vast, silent machinery of influence and enforcement that operated beneath the visible city the way subway tunnels operate beneath sidewalks. She gathered this not from dramatic revelations or whispered confessions, but from the small, accumulating details of life on the 20th floor. The men who came and went through the unmarked door, always in pairs, always speaking in low Korean that she couldn't understand, but whose tone she could read fluently: reports, updates, problems, solutions. The phone calls Dan took in his office with the door closed, his voice never rising, never falling, a flat and constant frequency that somehow communicated more authority than any shout ever could. She also learned, from a brief and unsentimental exchange between two of Dan's men outside her door, that Stephen Kenny had not remained in the elevator long. Hale's people had a security contact in the building, someone on the overnight shift who had helped arrange the elevator's malfunction in the first place. That same contact had pulled Stephen out within 20 minutes of Dan's departure, spiriting the enormous man down the freight entrance and into a waiting van before Dan's own team arrived to secure the scene. Stephen was alive. Stephen was recovered. And Stephen, she understood with a cold clarity that settled somewhere behind her sternum, was coming back. And she gathered it from the ledger itself. Dan had left it on the desk the following morning, open, the pages fanned under the gray light from the window. Mildred wasn't sure if it was a test or an invitation or simply a calculated decision, though she was rapidly learning that nothing Dan Dae-Jung did was unconsidered. But she sat in the soft chair and she read. The numbers told a story that her courier's brain understood faster than she expected. Routes, timelines, patterns. The ledger documented a systematic hemorrhage of funds through a network of shell companies, each one layered behind the next, like the rooms of a house designed by someone who never wanted to be found at home. But Mildred had spent 2 years navigating the hidden geography of New York City, the freight tunnels beneath Penn Station, the service corridors of every major high-rise in Manhattan. The loading docks and basement routes and unmarked service elevators that the visible city pretended didn't exist. She knew how things moved through this city. She knew the arteries and the capillaries. And looking at the ledger's routing codes and transfer schedules, she could see something that perhaps Dan, for all his power, could not see from above: the pattern on the ground. The physical choreography of where money and men and cargo actually moved. "These 3 shell companies," she said that afternoon, standing at Dan's desk with the ledger open between them, pointing with a finger that had stopped trembling sometime around noon. "They're all routed through the same freight address. It's a consolidation hub in Red Hook I've delivered there. Twice, maybe 3 times. It's listed as a cold storage facility, but the dock schedule doesn't match any commercial carrier I've ever seen. The pickups happen at 2 a.m. Nothing legitimate ships out of Red Hook at 2 a.m. Dan looked at her. Then he looked at the page. Then he looked at her again, and this time the assessment in his eyes had shifted, recalibrated from the careful evaluation of a problem to the quiet recognition of something unexpected and valuable. "You know this from delivering packages," he said. It was not quite a question. "I know this from surviving," Mildred corrected. She didn't say it with pride or with bitterness. She said it the way she might have read a delivery address aloud, factually, plainly, because it was simply true. 2 years of pedaling through the city's invisible corridors, of being waved through service entrances and freight gates by security guards who never looked at her face, had given Mildred a map of New York that existed in no database and on no screen. She knew which buildings connected through their basements. She knew which service elevators ran 24 hours and which ones shut down at midnight. She knew the rhythms of the city's hidden circulation the way a nurse knows the rhythms of a pulse, not because she had studied them, but because her life depended on reading them correctly. Dan was quiet for a long moment. He closed the ledger. He placed both tattooed hands flat on the desk and looked at Mildred Severt, the girl in the neon vest, the girl from the elevator, the girl who 24 hours ago had been clutching a delivery bag to her chest like a shield, and she saw something rearrange itself behind his eyes. Respect. The hard, unornamental kind. The kind that is not given freely and, once given, is not easily revoked. "You're not what I expected," he said. Mildred held his gaze. Her hands were still. Her breathing was even. The fear was still there, lodged somewhere beneath her ribs. A permanent tenant that she suspected would never fully move out, but it was no longer the only thing in the room. "I never am," she said. And somewhere, on a loading dock in Red Hook, a van with no plates was pulling away from a cold storage facility at 2 a.m., carrying cargo that smelled nothing like frozen food. And somewhere in a penthouse across the city, Victor Hale was picking up a phone to ask why Stephen Kenny hadn't delivered the ledger. And somewhere on the 20th floor of Tower Genevieve, a Korean man with tattooed hands and a courier with a neon vest were looking at the same page of a stolen ledger, seeing the same pattern, and arriving separately, silently, inevitably at the same conclusion. This was only the beginning. If you're hooked on Mildred and Dan Dae-Jung's impossible alliance, smash that subscribe button and ring the bell because the next chapter is going to be insane. Comment below Team Mildred or Team Underworld, and tell me where you're watching from. I would love to say hello to you just to know how far our story is going. Don't miss what happens next. Their partnership is about to face its deadliest test yet. See you in the next. It took Victor Hale exactly 72 hours to find her. Mildred had known, in the abstract and unavoidable way a person knows that winter follows autumn, that going back to her apartment was a risk. But the apartment held things that the 20th floor of Tower Genevieve did not: her identification documents, the envelope of emergency cash she kept taped behind the bathroom mirror, and the small framed photograph of her mother that sat on the windowsill above the radiator that clanked all night. Dan had sent 2 of his men with her. They were quiet, professional, armed beneath their jackets in ways that Mildred could sense but not see. The plan was simple: 15 minutes in and out, gather what she needed, and disappear from 143rd Street for what might be the last time. They made it 11 minutes. Mildred was in the bathroom, peeling the envelope from behind the mirror, when she heard it a sound so small it almost wasn't a sound at all. The soft, deliberate creak of her front door being tested from the outside. Not knocked on. Tested. The way a person tests a door when they don't want the person inside to know they're there. She froze. The envelope was half in her hand, the tape still clinging to the glass. Through the thin bathroom wall, she heard one of Dan's men say something sharp and short in Korean, and then the world came apart. The front door didn't open. It exploded inward, kicked from its hinges with a force that sent the deadbolt skittering across the linoleum like a broken tooth. 3 men came through the gap in rapid succession, and they were not the kind of men who tested doors quietly. They were the kind of men who had been sent to finish something, and they moved with the blunt, efficient aggression of people who had been promised that the thing they were finishing would not fight back. Dan's men fought back. The studio apartment, all 400 square feet of it, became a geography of violence that Mildred experienced primarily through sound. Because she was crouched behind the bathroom door with her hands over her ears and her forehead pressed against the tile floor, she heard the heavy, concussive impacts of bodies against drywall. She heard the sharp crack of a weapon being discharged once, twice, and the sound of glass shattering, and a voice she didn't recognize shouting something in English that contained her name. And then she heard a voice she did recognize. Dan. He wasn't supposed to be here. He had stayed at Tower Genevieve, monitoring the operation remotely, coordinating by phone. But he was here now. She could hear him in the hallway outside her apartment, his voice cutting through the chaos with the same flat, level authority he applied to everything. Except that this time, the authority was accompanied by the sound of a man being driven into a wall with enough force to crack the plaster. Mildred. His voice reached her through the bathroom door, steady and clear. Move. Now. She moved. She grabbed the envelope, shoved it into the pocket of her hoodie, and opened the bathroom door into a scene that her brain processed in disconnected snapshots. One of Dan's men on the floor, conscious but bleeding from a cut above his eyebrow. A stranger slumped against the kitchen counter, not moving. Dan, standing in the center of her tiny living room with his suit jacket torn at the shoulder and a thin line of red tracing his collarbone where something, a blade, a fragment, she couldn't tell, had opened the skin. He had put himself between the door and the hallway, between the men who had come for her and the bathroom where she'd been hiding. He had left the safety of his tower, driven across the city, and walked into a 400-square-foot studio apartment on 143rd Street to stand in the path of the violence that his world had sent in her direction. His breathing was slightly elevated. That was the only concession his body made to the fact that he had just fought 3 men in a space smaller than his office closet. The fire escape, he said. Go. They went. Down the rusted iron staircase she had sat on during those airless summer nights, the one bolted to the back of the building like an afterthought. Into the alley below that smelled exactly the way she remembered wet cardboard and gasoline, and into a black car that materialized at the curb with the silent punctuality of something that had been waiting there all along. Mildred pressed her back against the leather seat and watched her building shrink in the rear window, the lit square of her kitchen window, the curtain she'd never gotten around to replacing, the silhouette of the framed photograph she'd left on the sill. She didn't cry. She wanted to. But the tears felt like a luxury that belonged to the version of herself who had existed before the elevator, and that version was getting further away with every block. In the car, she turned to Dan. His hand was pressed flat against his collarbone, the white of his dress shirt darkening steadily beneath his fingers. He noticed her looking and moved his hand away, as if the wound were an administrative error he preferred not to acknowledge. You came, she said. I did. You didn't have to. Dan looked at her, and for the briefest moment, a fraction of a second that Mildred would remember for years afterward, something behind the granite calm of his expression shifted. Like a wall revealing, for an instant, the faintest outline of a door. Yes, he said quietly. I did. They rode the rest of the way in silence. By morning, Mildred had made a decision. She announced it to Dan over the untouched breakfast that had appeared on his desk. Black coffee, rice, grilled fish, arranged with a precision that suggested even the food in Dan's world followed orders. "I'm done hiding," she said. Dan looked up from the ledger, which he had been studying for the third consecutive hour with the silent intensity of a man memorizing a map before burning it. "Explain." "Every day I sit in this room is another day Hale gets to move his money, relocate his people, and close the gaps in his operation. He's already found my apartment, which means he's already accessed my dispatch records, which means he's already building a file on every route I've ever run. If we wait, he buries the evidence and buries me." She paused, and the pause was not the hesitant silence of a frightened woman gathering courage. It was the operational pause of someone organizing information. "But I know something he doesn't know I know." She pulled the ledger toward her and opened it to the page she'd been studying the night before, the routing codes, the transfer schedules, the 2 a.m. shipments through the cold storage facility in Red Hook. "This warehouse isn't just a financial pass-through," she said. "It's a physical hub. Everything Hale moves the cash, the product, the records goes through Red Hook because Red Hook connects to 3 separate freight tunnel systems that run beneath the waterfront. I've used those tunnels. I've delivered packages through service corridors that connect the warehouse district to the loading docks at the old transit depot 4 blocks north." She traced the route on the ledger's margin with her fingertip, drawing an invisible map in the air above the page. "If your people hit the warehouse from the front, Hale's men will scatter into the tunnels and disappear. But if someone who knows those tunnels is already inside, someone who knows which corridors dead end and which ones lead to the surface, you can seal every exit before they even know the front door has been kicked." In. Dan studied the invisible map. He studied the page. He studied Mildred. "You're proposing that you personally guide my team through a network of freight tunnels beneath a warehouse controlled by the man who just sent 3 armed men to your apartment." "I'm proposing that I stop being the package," Mildred said, "and start being the courier." Dan was quiet for a long time. Then he closed the ledger, straightened his cuff, and said, "Show me the route." She showed him. For the next 48 hours, the 20th floor of Tower Genevieve transformed into something between a war room and a classroom, with Mildred Severt as the unlikely instructor. She drew the tunnel network from memory on sheets of blank paper that Dan's men provided not architectural blueprints, but courier maps, annotated with the practical details that only someone who had physically navigated these spaces on a bicycle with a delivery bag would know. Which doors required keycard access, which corridors flooded during heavy rain, which junctions had security cameras, and which ones had been broken for months because the city didn't maintain infrastructure that nobody important used. Dan's lieutenants listened with careful attention. Among them was a man named Jun-Ho, stocky, quiet, with a jaw like a cinder block and the expressionless efficiency of someone who had been at Dan's side for years. He asked the most questions, took the most notes, and studied Mildred's hand-drawn maps with an intensity that she initially mistook for thoroughness. She would remember that intensity later. The operation was set for a Thursday night. Dan's crew would hit the Red Hook warehouse at 1 a.m., 1 hour before Hale's scheduled shipment, while Mildred guided a second team through the freight tunnels to seal the escape routes. Dan himself would carry the ledger. Secured in a reinforced case strapped to one of his lieutenants, the evidence needed to be on site to seize Hale's remaining records and match them against the originals. The plan was clean, precise, and built on the kind of ground-level knowledge that no amount of surveillance technology could replicate. What the plan did not account for was the double cross. They entered the tunnel system at 12:40 a.m., Mildred leading 3 of Dan's men through the service corridor beneath the old transit depot. The air underground was cold and damp, carrying the mineral smell of wet concrete and the distant, metallic hum of subway tracks running somewhere beyond the walls. Mildred moved with the practiced confidence of someone retracing a familiar route, her flashlight cutting through the darkness in short, efficient sweeps. They had sealed 2 of the 3 exits and were approaching the third, a freight door that opened directly into the warehouse's lower level, when Mildred's earpiece crackled with a sound that was not Dan's voice, and was not a signal, and was not anything good. Gunfire. Close. Above them. The warehouse assault had started early, or the warehouse had been waiting for them, or both. The distinction didn't matter because the result was the same. The tunnel ahead of Mildred flooded with the sound of running boots and shouting voices, and the freight door burst open from the other side, spilling light and chaos and men into the corridor like water breaching a dam. Mildred's team was split in seconds. 2 of Dan's men were driven back toward the sealed exits by a group of Hale's enforcers who had clearly been positioned in the tunnels in advance, which meant someone had given them the exact routes Mildred had drawn on. Those sheets of blank paper. Someone who had sat in that war room, studied her maps, and memorized every corridor and junction she'd described. The 3rd man grabbed Mildred's arm and pulled her sideways into a maintenance alcove, pressing her against the wall as the corridor erupted into the sharp, percussive language of close-quarters violence. "Stay here," he said, and then he was gone, drawn into the fight by the physics of loyalty and necessity, and Mildred was alone in the dark. She pressed herself into the alcove and tried to breathe. The maintenance corridor branched ahead of her left toward the warehouse, right toward a utility junction she had used once, 18 months ago, while delivering a set of architectural plans to a construction office in the waterfront district. She remembered the junction. She remembered it led upward, through a vertical access shaft, into the warehouse's main floor. She also remembered that going right meant moving deeper into the building that Victor Hale controlled. She went right. The utility junction was exactly where her memory had placed it. A narrow, steel-walled passage that angled upward at a steep grade, ending at a hatch that opened into the warehouse's ground level. Mildred climbed in the dark, her hands finding the rungs of the access ladder by feel, the sounds of the firefight below filtering up through the walls like a distant, arrhythmic pulse. She pushed the hatch open and emerged into a section of the warehouse that was vast, dim, and stacked with shipping containers arranged in rows like the shelves of a library written in corrugated steel. She was looking for Dan. That was the only thought her brain could sustain, find Dan. Because Dan was somewhere in this building, and the operation had gone wrong, and if the tunnels had been compromised, then Dan had walked into a trap. She found Stephen Kenny instead. He was standing at the end of a corridor between 2 shipping containers, and he was not unconscious this time. He was not crumpled on the floor of a brass-paneled elevator with blood on his jaw. He was upright, enormous, and very much awake, and he was looking directly at her with the flat, patient expression of a man who had been given a second chance at something he had failed to finish the first time. "There you are," he said. His voice echoed between the containers, low and thick and unhurried. He stepped toward her, 1 step, then another. His fingerless gloves flexed at his sides. The black tank top stretched across his chest like a warning label. Mildred's body told her to freeze. Every nerve, every synapse, every primitive circuit in her hindbrain fired the same ancient instruction. Stop moving, stop breathing, become small, become invisible, become nothing. It was the same instruction that had pinned her to the corner of the elevator, the same paralysis that had kept her eyes squeezed shut while Stephen's breath heated her forehead. But Mildred was not in an elevator. She was in a warehouse. And a warehouse, unlike an elevator, has exits. She ran. Not blindly. Not in panic. She ran the way a courier runs, with spatial awareness, with route knowledge, with the instinctive calculation of a person whose survival has always depended on knowing what lay around the next corner. She cut left between 2 containers, then right through a gap she judged by width to be too narrow for Stephen's shoulders. She heard him behind her, the heavy, metronomic thunder of his boots on concrete, the sound of his body clipping the edge of a container as he forced himself through the gap she had slipped through easily. He was faster than a man his size should have been, but he was not faster than a woman who had spent 2 years navigating spaces designed for cargo, not people. She led him deeper into the warehouse, deliberately. She could feel the architecture of the building now, its rhythms, its geometry, the way the containers were arranged in a grid that created corridors and dead ends and blind corners. She had never been in this specific warehouse before, but she had been in dozens like it, and warehouses, like cities, spoke a language that Mildred had learned to read. She turned a final corner and found what she was looking for. A narrow service corridor with a steel fire door at the far end, a wall-mounted electrical panel to her left, and a length of heavy chain, the kind used to secure shipping containers during transport, coiled on the concrete floor like a sleeping snake. She grabbed the chain. She pressed herself flat against the wall beside the electrical panel, and she waited. Stephen came around the corner at full speed, his momentum carrying him 3 steps past her position before his brain registered that the corridor was empty. He skidded. He turned. Mildred swung the chain. It connected with the electrical panel beside his head. Not with his head, but with the panel, which was exactly what she had intended, because the panel's cover had been hanging loose on rusted hinges, and the impact tore it free, exposing the bare wiring beneath. The shower of sparks caught Stephen across the face and chest, blinding him for the 2 seconds Mildred needed to drive her shoulder into the fire door and burst through to the other side. She found Dan on the other side. He was on one knee behind a concrete support pillar. A dark stain was spreading across the left sleeve of his suit jacket at the bicep, where a ricochet or a fragment had torn through the fabric and into the muscle beneath. She could see the ragged edge of the hole, the wet gleam of blood soaking the wool. His left arm hung at his side, functional but compromised, and he held it close to his body with the grim pragmatism of a man who had already calculated how much strength he had left and was allocating it accordingly. 2 of his men flanked him, weapons drawn, covering the corridor ahead. The firefight had moved to the far end of the warehouse, distant now, the sounds contracting like a storm moving out to sea. Dan looked up as Mildred came through the fire door. His eyes swept her quickly, comprehensively, checking for damage, and something in his expression changed when he saw that she was intact. Something closer to confirmation, as if a hypothesis he had been developing about her had just been validated. "Stephen," she said, breathing hard. "He's behind me, the corridor. He's—" Dan nodded once, and one of his men moved past her through the fire door with the calm efficiency of a job long rehearsed. There was a brief, ugly sound from the corridor, 1 impact, possibly 2, and then silence. It was over. Not the night. The night continued for several more hours, the methodical, unglamorous work of securing the warehouse, collecting the evidence that Hale's men had failed to destroy, and extracting the wounded. But the war, the specific 3-year war that had been waged in ledger entries and shell companies and 2 AM shipments, was over. Victor Hale was found in a back office on the warehouse's upper level. He was smaller than Mildred had expected, a narrow, gray-haired man in a rumpled dress shirt, surrounded by the confetti of documents he had been feeding into a shredder when Dan's men kicked in the door. The shredder was still running, its motor whining in the sudden silence, half a page still dangling from its teeth. Hale's hands were ink-stained. His eyes were red. He looked up at Dae-Jung standing in the doorway, arm bleeding, suit ruined, face carrying the same terrifying calm it had carried the night. He'd pried open an elevator, and whatever remaining defiance Victor Hale had been hoarding collapsed like a structure that had been hollowed out from the inside. Long before anyone thought to push it. "The ledger," Dan said. Just that. No threats, no speeches, no satisfaction in his voice. One of his men stepped forward and placed the reinforced case on the desk, opened it, and set the original leather-bound ledger beside the half-shredded remains of what were clearly Hale's matching records. The evidence was complete. The circle was closed. Hale said nothing. There was nothing left to say. Mildred sat on the tailgate of a parked truck outside the warehouse as the first gray light of Friday morning crept across the Red Hook waterfront. Her hoodie was torn at the elbow. There was a bruise forming along her left forearm where she'd hit the fire door. The neon-green delivery vest was gone. She'd left it at Tower Genevieve days ago, folded on the nightstand of the guest room, and she had not once thought about putting it back on. Dan approached her. His left arm was in a proper sling now, a temporary measure applied by someone with medical training and minimal bedside manner. His suit was ruined, torn, stained, blood darkened at the sleeve in a way that no dry cleaner could reverse. But his hair was still slicked back, his posture was still straight. And his eyes, when they met hers, still carried that calm she had once found unreadable but was beginning to understand that what lived behind it was not emptiness but discipline. And what lived behind the discipline was a man who had chosen his code the way other people choose their religion, completely, permanently, and without apology. He sat beside her on the tailgate. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The waterfront smelled like brine and diesel and the faint, clean scent of a city rinsing itself in the early morning. Before he could speak, Mildred said, "It was Jun-ho." Dan's eyes didn't widen, his jaw didn't tighten, but the stillness that settled over his body was the stillness of a man absorbing a wound he had already suspected was coming. "The tunnel positions," Mildred continued. "Hale's men were stationed at every junction I marked on my maps. Not the obvious ones, the secondary corridors, the maintenance alcoves, the routes I drew specifically because they were hard to find. Nobody outside that room had access to those drawings. And Junho asked me more questions about the tunnel layout than anyone else." She paused. "He also asked me which route I'd be taking personally." Dan was quiet. He looked out at the waterfront, at the gray water and the distant cranes and the pale light gathering strength above the skyline. Then he took his phone from his jacket pocket, the same unhurried motion, the same deliberate precision, and spoke a single sentence in Korean. He put the phone away. "It will be handled," he said. And from the way he said it, Mildred understood that handled was a word that carried several possible meanings in Dae-Jung's vocabulary, and none of them involved a second chance. The silence that followed was different from the silences that had come before. It was not the silence of fear. It was not the silence of calculation. It was the silence of two people sitting in the aftermath of something enormous, letting the weight of it settle. "I have an account," Dan said. "In a bank that doesn't ask questions. I can put enough money in it to let you disappear. New city, new name. An apartment with a window that locks and a landlord who answers the phone." He paused. "You've earned it. Several times over." Mildred looked at the waterfront. She looked at the warehouse. She looked at her hands, calloused, bruised, steady. "And do what?" she asked. "Whatever you want. The point is that you'd be safe." "Safe," she repeated, and the word felt strange in her mouth. Not wrong exactly, but incomplete, like a sentence missing its second half. She had spent her entire adult life pursuing safety, keeping her head down, taking the late-night deliveries, absorbing the bad tips, pedaling through the rain, making herself small and invisible and agreeable because safety, she had always believed, was the thing you purchased with silence and compliance. And silence and compliance had delivered her into an elevator with Stephen Kenny. She turned to Dan. "I don't want to disappear," she said. "I want to stay." Dan studied her. The assessment was familiar now, the quiet inventory of a man weighing variables, but there was something new in it. A door that had been closed was open, not wide, just enough. "If you stay," he said, "you stay as an equal, not a courier, not a witness, not someone I owe a debt to." He extended his tattooed hand. "A strategist." Mildred looked at the hand. She thought about the last time he had offered it to her in the amber gloom of a stalled elevator, while a mountain of a man lay unconscious at his feet. She had taken it then because she had no choice. She took it now because she did. And somewhere in a bank that didn't ask questions, an account was opened in a name that wasn't Mildred Severt's, though it carried enough money to pay off 7 months of back rent, replace a cracked phone screen, and ensure that a landlord on 143rd Street would never again go unanswered. And somewhere in a guest room on the 20th floor of Tower Genevieve, a neon green delivery vest sat folded on a nightstand, gathering dust, belonging to a woman who no longer existed. And somewhere in the back of a black car heading uptown through the clean, gray light of a Friday morning, a Korean man with tattooed hands and a courier with steady ones were sitting side by side, not speaking, not needing to two people who had walked into each other's worlds through a set of pried open elevator doors and discovered, against every expectation, that they were exactly what the other had been missing. The doors were open, and Mildred Severt was never going back. This story is about to get even more twisted. Drop a comment, do you think their alliance can survive this ultimate test? Like this video if you're obsessed with this unlikely partnership that keeps getting more dangerous. The next chapter drops soon, and trust me, you are not ready for the truth about what Mildred really carried in that bag. See you in the next one, if the real Mildred survives.